it's very interesting that there were a number of people who, for one reason or another, just can't get here at this particular time, but they were very intrigued by this question of should we be compromising ourselves for our children? And as soon as I shared that topic, I thought, hang on a second, I think people are going to completely misinterpret what I mean. So what, like, for example, what went through your mind when you heard that?
I'm looking here. I didn't even read the.
Oh, you didn't even read?
topic.
Okay, fine.
I can recall
So I'm just saying there were some people who like this was clearly a big issue for them. So the question is, should we compromise ourselves for our children? Initially, I was going to call it something else. Initially, I was going to say, should we bend the rules for the people we love? Because it's really the same principle. When I say compromise ourselves, I'm not necessarily talking about the fact that we're going to do things that are uncomfortable for ourselves in order to look after our children, educate our children, etc. Because that's kind of par for the course. That's just what happens. It's unavoidable. It comes in the instruction manual. If you want to have children, you have to anticipate that it's going to come at a cost to yourself. First, it's going to cost you sleep. That will be the first thing. And then it will cost you peace of mind. And you'll always prioritize. Like, for example, if you watch a mother feed her child. So it could be your very favorite food in the whole world, but if your child wants some, you're going to give your child, and maybe they'll finish the food and you won't even get to have it. But that's considered par for the course. That's just how we are. It's not what I mean. That's not what we're going to discuss today. I'm not going to rub everybody in with the parental guilt and all the feelings of inadequacy and all the overcompensation and all that kind of stuff. That's not what we're going to be doing over here today. I'm coming from a very, very different angle, actually. And that is, in order to bring up decent children, one of the most important things that we have to have is clear values. And then we have to communicate those values, and we have to expect the children to live up to those values. And one of the tightropes that we have to walk as parents is the balance between having, expressing, and demanding those values. And demanding is maybe sometimes a loaded word because nobody wants to demand anything, and you want to command respect and not demand respect. Is a little bit different. So the balance between, on the one hand, creating those expectations, and then, on the other hand, dealing with what happens when those expectations are not met. And that's what I mean by compromise ourselves for our children. In other words, I set a particular standard. I said this is what we believe. I said this is how we behave. How often have you heard parents, particularly mothers, saying that? That's not how we speak in this family, which supposedly is this gentle way of saying, that's not how you should behave, right? So this is not how we behave in this family. It's not how we speak in this family. You very often hear people expressing this in one way or another, this frustration with the fact that we have values, we have standards, we have expectations, and you're not living up to that. And I think one of the most painful things for a parent is when that happens. You know, when it's a little child, it's one thing, okay, they're learning, they make some mistakes along the way, etc. When it's an older child, it becomes a lot more painful. You don't respect the values that we have. You don't behave in line with what our family is all about. What happens when people don't necessarily respect the same religious ideals that we have? You know how often, as a rabbi, people ask me, what would you do if? Which is essentially the question of, if your child, God forbid, did X or Y, which is completely unacceptable behavior, how would you as a rabbi relate to that? And it's a really difficult question, because I don't think it has anything to do with being a rabbi. I think it has to do with being a parent who cares about your children, and about how your children are going to grow up, and about the values that they're supposed to have. So one of the most painful things is when they don't have those values, or when they don't respect those values, or when they let us down or embarrass us. And I don't mean embarrass us just like the child who says out loud what they shouldn't say out loud. You know, oh, look at that lady, she's so old, you know, or something like that. That's embarrassing, but it's cute at the same time. I'm not talking about that embarrassment. I'm talking about the kind of embarrassment where people look at us and say, but you were always the individual who, and they can fill in the blanks, who was so respectful, who was so present for everybody else, who was so dedicated to your Judaism, etc. And what happened? And it's a very, whether people say it out loud or not, it's a very, very uncomfortable experience to have. So that's what I mean when I'm asking the question, should we compromise ourselves for our children? Not compromise our needs for our children. That's a different discussion. So compromise sleep, let the child learn to drive on your car, which could be a real compromise of your safety and your sensibilities and so on. I'm not talking about should we compromise on, okay, fine, I'll let you go to your friend. I'm not talking about any of those things. I'm talking here about values. When there's a clash of values, which are surely what should be really, really important to us as parents, and it's not working, it's not getting through, the child is not living up to those values, the child is maybe going against those values, should we compromise for the sake of our child? And that's a really big question. That's why I think people find it so fascinating to ask the question as a rabbi. You know, they always ask, as a rabbi. Because they assume that the most devastating thing that could ever happen to a rabbi is that your child decides they're not going to be so religious. It's like very often, even not as extreme as that, people always ask me, will all your boys become rabbis? Like they think that the most insulting thing that could ever happen to me is if one of my boys decides not to become a rabbi. Like that's going to be devastating, surely, because this is what you've invested your life in, this is your legacy, and this is your value set, and whatever. What's going to happen if? So, to be honest, I could think of much worse things that could happen than a son who decides that they're not going to become a rabbi. But if somebody had to ask the question, how would you deal with the fact that your child had become, God forbid, a criminal? That, I think, is going to be not only as a rabbi, which would be a problem for any person. So that's what we've got to try and unpack over here. Now, if you have a look through our history, we have no shortage of great people in our history who had to deal with this issue. No shortage. And we're not going to look at any of them as an example, in spite of the fact that they might be really, really good examples. So, for example, you've got Abraham who has Yishmael, not an easy one. Not only does he have the dynamic of Yishmael, who doesn't keep the same family values and who does target practice with his little half-brother Yitzchak and all of the other very aberrant behavior that he's involved in, but there's another dynamic over there. There's Sarah who says, get this guy out of my house. I don't want this kind of influence around my child, Yitzchak. So there's a double layer of dynamics that are playing out, and it deserves its own attention. And we should do a shir on it and an analysis of parenting in the Abraham and Sarah model and how you deal with these rebellious elements. Okay, good point, important discussion, not today's discussion. And likewise, you could say Yitzchak and Rivka would be another example of how to deal with a wayward child, because they had Esav, and they're both of the parents, are the biological parents of this child. So they both have the same kind of vested issues and biases, and yet there's two completely different parenting styles. You've got Yitzchak, who appears to indulge Esav, and Rivka, who appears to take none of it. So that would also be a great lesson in its own right, not the subject of today's conversation. And the truth is, the one we don't really get a lot of insight about is how Yaakov handles his sons mistreating their brother and then eventually selling him. And that's when they decided, after all, they were not going to kill him, which must have been a traumatic experience for any parent, especially considering that the Torah tells us that Yaakov had a particular soft spot for Yosef. And yet the Torah gives us no insight, really, into how he manages the process. So also possibly a great example of how do you compromise yourself or your values. Here, he's not only compromising his religious values, he's compromising, or dealing with his children is going to compromise the love that he has for his special son Yosef. And how does he manage and navigate all of that? Be an interesting conversation. It's not going to be our conversation today. So by this point, you're probably wondering, well, what on earth? You've taken the best examples of individuals who had to navigate a path with a child that did not see eye to eye with their value system, and you're just dismissing them out of hand. Like, you know, where else? I don't know. Who else could you come up with who has anything close in terms of issues and challenges? So the reason we're not going to look at these personalities, even though they are archetypes of how Jews should behave, is for one reason only for today's conversation, and that is they all are pre the state of the Jewish people. In other words, at that stage of history, there's no Torah yet, there's no homogeneous experience of connection to Hashem that is expected of us. And so it may, in a certain respect, lack some bearing on our own lives. Because at that stage, before the Torah was given, every person really had to find their own way. And not everybody was going to land up on the same path. So it's not necessarily an ideal example to use. We'd probably prefer to have an example of somebody after the giving of the Torah, because that's closer to our experience of how you're supposed to parent, how you're supposed to bring children up. Now, don't get me wrong. After the Torah was given, there is an abundance of examples of people who had to deal with problem children. And maybe the best example that jumps out would be King David, because he had so much tzoros from some of his children. So that would be a great example to examine. Let's find out how King David led his life and how he dealt with children who rebelled against him, who wanted to usurp the throne, who were ready to kill each other. I mean, like really hectic stuff that went on in King David's life. That'd be a good example for us. However, what's that?
That sounds like King David's
Yeah,
school.
it's got to be.
Also,
Sometimes you've got to be careful what you name something after, or who you name something after, because you don't know what kind of energy you might be inviting. So that might have been a great example as well for us to examine and to learn, except that in King David's example, we don't see much compromise. He indulges Avshalom a little bit. He indulges Adoniyahu a lot. But we're not going to use that example, and I'll tell you why not, because if we're saying that this catalyst, this change in terms of our experience of being Jewish people is at the time of the giving of the Torah, let's try to get as close to the time of the giving of the Torah as we possibly can to find an example. And you know what? Let's actually go one step deeper and ask ourselves this question. What would you say should be the ultimate relationship or example that we should model parenting after? And notice I said what, not who. So let's think about this for a second. Where's the best place that you could dig down and find out where there is insight into how you should be a parent? The Torah. But let's be a little bit more specific. I agree with that. Obviously, it's going to be in the Torah. So now the question is a little bit more specifically, what in the Torah, or what kind of interaction, relationship in the Torah is going to be the ultimate example of a relationship of a parent and a child? Hashem and us. Right? We say it all the time in our davening, certainly in Rosh Hashanah, Avinu Malkeinu. But the truth is, frequently we refer to Hashem as our Father, and He refers to us as His children. In fact, the introductory moment when Moses goes to Pharaoh and he has to tell him that you have to let the Jewish people free, he introduces it by saying, you need to know who these people are. Beni Bechori Yisrael. These people Hashem calls His firstborn child. And so therefore the relationship that Hashem has with the Jewish people is like the relationship of a parent to a child. And therefore if you abuse these children, you can anticipate that you're going to have a tremendous backlash from the Father, from Hashem, which is eventually what happens in the 10 plagues and then eventually the plague of the firstborns and the exodus from Egypt. So there we have it. There we have the framing that if you want to understand how the relationship between a parent and a child should work, what better model than to model ourselves after Hashem's relationship with us? So now, where are we going to find the details of that relationship? Of course, you can tell me throughout the whole of Jewish history, it's an ongoing relationship, right? But you know what you have to do? You always have to set out the bounds of that relationship. And it's exactly the same as a parent and a child. There is absolutely no value in getting frustrated with our kids and expecting them to behave in a particular way, and then getting insulted or annoyed or angry when they don't, if we've never given them the guidelines. That's actually really unfair. You can't expect that a child's going to behave a certain way just because they work it out on their own. And so one of the key things that we learn about parenting is you have to create clear expectations. If you don't have clear expectations, then you can't imagine that children, out of some kind of ingrained wisdom, are going to know how they should behave. Likewise, it would be equally unfair of Hashem to get frustrated, disappointed, or angry with us if we're not doing the things that He expects, unless He creates a clear set of expectations, right? Make sense? Got to create a clear sense of expectations. One of the most frustrating things in a relationship is when somebody is annoyed because you should have anticipated what they wanted. Well, tell me what you want and I'll be able to honor it. But you don't tell me what you want. What do you expect from me? I'm not a mind reader. We don't think the same. And especially if you're talking about a child doesn't yet have the life experience or the maturity to be able to know these things, unless, of course, the parent is going to give them that clear sense of direction. So the question is, how do you get that clear sense of direction from Hashem? If Hashem is our parent, how do you get that clear sense of direction from your parent? Okay, that's the question that we have to ask. So Nu, where are you going to find a clear set of directions from Hashem to His children, how He expects them to behave, which in turn will then use as the model for how a parent is supposed to deal with their children? Okay, so where are we going to find that? The first time He talks to us. It's got to be, right? In fact, when I say first time that He talks to us, it's not necessarily accurate. Maybe the correct way to say it is the only time he talks to us. Because the rest of the time he talks to Moshe, and then Moshe has to convey the message to us. The only time that Hashem speaks to us en masse as the Jewish people is at the giving of the Ten Commandments, which is the giving of the whole Torah at Sinai. So essentially what Hashem does in that framework is he takes the whole of Judaism and he compacts it into 10 original instructions that he's going to present to us at Mount Sinai. We also know what happened at that point in time. It was too overwhelming, and we did not have the capacity to absorb what Hashem had to say. And so it turns out that out of 10, he only ends up telling us 2 out of the 10 commandments. The first, I am Hashem your God, and the second, that you should have no other gods besides me. That means that Hashem has successfully summarized all of his expectations into 2 lines. One is what you should do as a Jewish person, and one is what you should avoid doing as a Jewish person. For the purposes of our conversation today, we're going to focus only on the first one. We're only going to focus on what Hashem said we should do. What's the core of being a Jewish person? Now, if we're going to parent properly, then we're going to try and design our parenting to match the model that Hashem gives of his parenting. And that's really what it is to be a Jewish person, is to translate into our lives those things that the Torah tells us about Hashem and us. In various places, not only in the context of parenting, but in various places, we see that the Torah tells us that you've got to observe how Hashem behaves in order to know how to behave. So, for example, the Gemara tells us the early stories that we have with Hashem are all stories of benevolence. Hashem introduces Adam to Eve. So therefore, we should help people to find their soulmates. And even before that, immediately after that, Adam and Eve recognize the fact that they are naked. And so Hashem provides them with clothing. From that we learn that we're supposed to help people who don't have clothing. And later on, when Abraham has his bris and he's in a lot of pain, Hashem comes to visit him. And from that we learn that you're supposed to visit the sick. And after Sarah passes away, Hashem extends comfort as he does to both Abraham and Yitzchak. From that we learn that if a person is grieving, we're supposed to go and console them, and so on and so forth. So we learn we're supposed to model our behavior after how Hashem behaves, not only because it's an example of how to behave, but because whatever Hashem does is the perfect version of how it's supposed to be done. So if we model after the perfect version, we're obviously not going to be perfect, but we'll get a lot closer to doing the right thing than if we were just modeling after a book that we read or a speaker that we listened to. So in this first line, Hashem says, I am Hashem your God who took you out of Egypt. Embedded in that line is everything that we have to know about setting the stage for how we should interact with our own children, which is quite fascinating, right? Nobody ever thought of that. I mean, definitely don't go home and tell your children, I am the Lord your God. Don't even tell your children, as some parents might be tempted to do, who took you out of wherever. There's that old saying of I think it's the Italian mother who tells her child when he's misbehaving, I brought you into this world and I'll take you out of this world, if you don't behave. So you're not supposed to come with this overbearing kind of threatening tone, which says, if not for me, you wouldn't survive, you wouldn't be here, you would never have made it this far, therefore you should give me respect. There's obviously got to be something a lot more that's going on over here. So what we're going to do is we're going to analyze this first verse of the Ten Commandments in the context of how it is between Hashem and us. And then from that, we're going to extract some lessons in terms of how it should be between us and our children. But you first have to look at it in its pristine form and understand our relationship with Hashem. Because even if we get the parenting side of this as an interpretation, we've got to know that the original version of our relationship with Hashem is absolutely accurate. This is not open to interpretation. So let's have a look. Hashem says, I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt, which raises a series of questions right at the beginning. A series of questions. What is Hashem instructing us at this point? It does not sound like there's an instruction in that sentence. It sounds like it's a statement of fact or an introduction of credentials. Like when the person gets up at the wedding, the MC gets up at the wedding and says, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, my name is X and I'm related to the groom this way. they're basically stating their credentials, right? Why it is that they should be interrupting our meal and getting up in front of the crowd and talking. But Hashem doesn't have to do that, surely. So I am Hashem your God who took you out of Egypt seems superfluous. Why is he doing this? Why is he telling it to us? And there doesn't appear to be a direct instruction in those words. The next one is a clear instruction. Do not have any other gods. That's a clear instruction. But where's the instruction in this particular sentence? That's the one question we have to focus on. The other question we have to focus on is, why does Hashem have to say, who took you out of Egypt? Why is that relevant at this particular point in time? Let's remember, no matter how ADHD the community might have been back then, and I don't think they were nearly as bad as people are today, and I don't know how bad people's memories are, there's no question that a mere 7 weeks after leaving Egypt, they were still acutely aware of how they got out. They don't need this big stage announcement and reminder. At the foot of Sinai, which is now flaming and full of cloud, and there's lightning and thunder, and Hashem's voice is booming from every perceivable direction, to say what? I am Hashem, your God, who took you out of Egypt. Well, if not for that, we wouldn't be standing here right now. Surely that's very obvious. So what's the messaging? 2 questions. What's the message? What's the instruction? And secondly, what is the messaging in saying, who took you out of Egypt? Rashi makes an interesting observation. Rashi says that what Hashem is telling us is kedai, interesting word in Hebrew, kedai. Kedai means it is appropriate. Because I took you out of Egypt, that you should be, again in Rashi's words, meshubadim li. You should be subservient to me. So there are 2 key phrases that Rashi is using over there that we have to analyze. Kedai, it's appropriate. What do you mean it's appropriate? And secondly, meshubadim, that you should be subservient to me. What does it mean by subservient? So most people tell you, well, that's the instruction. The instruction is, you have to accept my authority. In fact, I had this conversation earlier today with another group of people, and when I asked them, what is the instruction in the first of the 10 commandments, they said the instruction is that you should accept my authority. And that actually makes a lot of sense, because let's say, for example, in the Shema, the first line of the Shema is supposed to be to accept Hashem's authority. And then the next paragraph, to love Hashem with all your heart and all your soul and your might, is to commit yourself to doing what he says. Because logically, that's how it works. First, you have to acknowledge authority, and then you'll listen to what that authority says. If you don't acknowledge the authority, why would you follow any of the rules? So that's how most people understand this particular line, that Hashem is saying, first accept my authority, and then, once you've agreed to that, we can get into the details, which are don't serve idols, don't murder, etc. And you might actually feel that it's very similar with parenting, right? I am the parent in the story, because sometimes, especially in today's world, children believe that it's a horizontal relationship between themselves and their parents, and they have the rights to an opinion, they have the rights to argue back, they sometimes know better than their parents, and have probably looked it up already using AI, and they've got more insight than the parents necessarily have. So sometimes you might want to say that's what it's all about, right? To say, you have to know who's the boss over here. As long as, I'm sure every parent has said this at some point in some form, as long as you are living under this roof and eating my food, you are going to follow my rules. So you have to establish authority, right? And that's what it sounds like. That's how most people understand what Hashem is doing over here, which is that he's establishing his authority. We have to accept that authority, and then, of course, the details will follow. However, that is already encapsulated in I am Hashem, your God. You don't add anything to that by saying who took you out of Egypt. That does not make you recognize his authority any more than by the fact that he says, I am Hashem, your God. That means I am the authority. So we still have to understand why it's so important and why it's included in the 10 Commandments to tell us that he took us out of Egypt. Why is that such a critical part of the story? And this might be a very powerful insight into understanding what Judaism is all about. What was it like to be in Egypt? Yes, humans are funny. And we have this incredible ability to reinterpret our past nostalgically, even when it wasn't so nostalgic. For example, you, I'm sure, have had the conversation with your children or grandchildren, as the case may be, When I was young, we could go to the shop with, and then you describe some amount of money that the kids don't recognize. And with that amount of money, we could get this, and we could get that, and we could get the other thing. Or we could go to a movie and get a popcorn and a Coke and a whatever and take the bus. And it was all for the amount of money that children today wouldn't even consider to be money. Sounds very nostalgic, right? It sounds like life in those days was amazing. Now, the truth is, there were things about life in those days that were amazing, and there were other things that were not so amazing. In those days, when you could buy all of those things for that amount of money, people could die of diseases that today are curable. So it's a funny thing about human psychology that we tend to glorify the past. And that's exactly what happens to the Jewish people through the course of the desert. They keep saying, oh, who remembers the good old days in Egypt? That's how they start to talk. Remember the good old days in Egypt when we used to get fish that was given to us for free when they're complaining about the food. Or if only we had just stayed in Egypt. Why did we have to come out to die in the desert? They use those kinds of expressions. So there is this romanticizing of the past, which is very much part of human psychology. But if we're objective about it, what was it like to be in Egypt? It was horrible. It was horrible. The human being is a resilient creature, and therefore we find ways to discover joy even in the most horrible circumstances, but it was horrible. We had zero freedom. We couldn't leave physically. We had to work to a particular expectation. At the end of the story, just before the Exodus, everything got worse. They took away the resources. They made the slaves work harder. But the most important thing is that they were slaves. And the notion of being a slave, and this is really, really important, is somebody who's out of control. Meaning to say, I don't have the capacity for control. Somebody else is pulling the strings. So it means I'm out of control. I don't have the capacity for control. And that's the irony of Egypt. They're living in an ironclad society without any capacity for growth. So in other words, if somebody is in an environment where everything is dictated, then that person cannot grow. They can be held, they can be guided, they can be directed, but they cannot grow. So to be in Egypt means to be in a state where you are completely paralyzed. And you could believe that things are good because you know what to expect. As the cliche goes, better the devil you know. You know that you're going to get a certain amount of food. You know that you never have to worry about owning a passport because you're never leaving. There's certain things that you know. But your life is not a life, because a life without movement, without growth, without potential, without opportunity, that is not a life. When Hashem takes us out of Egypt, and we spoke about this a couple of weeks ago, when Hashem took us out of Egypt, that was not to give us freedom. It's a terrible mistake that people make. People assume that the opposite of subjugation is freedom. That's a terrible mistake. And that's essentially what every child argues with their parents about. I want freedom. And that's why children are forever telling us stories about, well, little Yankel in my class, his bedtime is no bedtime. He has the freedom to choose when he wants to go to sleep. He doesn't have limits on his phone. He could go on his phone whenever he wants. So-and-so, my friend, her mother never says that they can only have treats on Shabbos. They eat sugar whenever they want, in whatever quantity they want, and so on and so forth. Children are always arguing for freedom. And parents sometimes fall into that trap because people believe that the opposite of subjugation is freedom, and the corollary of that is the opposite of freedom is subjugation. And that's false. The opposite of subjugation is growth opportunity. If a person is locked into an environment where there's no opportunity to grow, that is prison, that is slavery, that is abuse. If a person is given unguided freedom, that is a different form of slavery and a different form of abuse. It's no healthier than locking the child up. So unguided freedom is no healthier than no freedom. All growth, all maturity, all development happens in healthy structures. So Hashem says to the Jewish people, I am Hashem your God who took you out of Egypt. You need to realize, taking you out of Egypt was not a free pass to do whatever on earth you want, because that would destroy you. Look at history. Any time in history that there's been a group of people who are subjugated to another group of people, and then they built themselves up, and they either formed an army and then conquered their conquerors, or they formed a liberation movement and were able to break free of their conquerors. Any time that happened, those societies flamed up into this tremendous success story that fizzled out after a period of time. And all of history is filled with stories that the beginning of the decline of any great society or empire was the point where they had nothing left to have to fight for. So as soon as they reached that pinnacle of opulence, of hedonism, of luxury, of extravagance, that's when they began to decline. And that is an axiom across history. Hashem says to the Jewish people, I took you out of Egypt. Not you are free from Egypt. This is not a declaration of the fact that all of the stuff that was so difficult in your life has now been absolved and resolved, and now you're a free agent. No, I took you out of Egypt. And if I'm taking you out of Egypt, that means I'm taking you with a view to growth, structure, responsibility, moral values. I took you out of Egypt. Not you were freed from Egypt. Massive difference. There's now a responsibility that you have to live your life mishubadim li. In other words, kedai, it's appropriate. It's appropriate when you consider that I took you out of Egypt. It's appropriate for you to value what I value. I am Hashem your God. You have to accept my authority. That's step one. Who took you out of Egypt? Step two. Not only should you value my authority, not only should you respect my authority, not only should you listen to me, but you should start to subject yourself to the things that I value. In other words, this is not just about following a rule book. If Hashem wanted us just simply to follow a rule book, then he would have said, I am the Lord who instructs you these things. But he doesn't say that. He says, I am the Lord who took you out of Egypt, which Rashi says means you are now beholden to me. That means I don't want you to just consult the rule book and play by the rule book and be a goody two-shoes kind of personality. I want you to embrace the things I value. And if you think about it, that's exactly what Judaism is. Any other spiritual discipline has their laws that relate to religious things. There's no such concept, I know this is a bit of a stretch example, but just to illustrate the point. In any other spiritual discipline, there's no such concept that the discipline mandates how you tie your shoes in the morning. It's a uniquely Jewish problem. You know, they always joke about if other religions would apply the same strictures of halachic parameters to their traditions, what would it look like? So let's say, for example, I'll use something that's not overly religious. Halloween. So if you had to apply like halachic standards to Halloween, you'd have all these questions. What's the earliest time you can put out your jack-o'-lantern? What's the minimum size the pumpkin has to be in order to fulfill the halachic obligations? How long after the holiday do you have to remove all of your decorations? Are you allowed to trick and treat more than once at the same address? You know, what's the earliest time to start? What's the latest time to finish? What size? What's the minimum size of candy that you have to get? You know, like all that kind of stuff. Because in Judaism, the objective is not simply just to do a checklist and say, these are the things that Hashem expects of me, and I'm going to do those things because I want to be a good person and because I want to conform. Meshubad, beholden, means outside of the black and white, outside of the list. Where is my heart? Where is my head? What am I supposed to be thinking? How am I supposed to conduct myself all of the time? That's what it is to be Jewish. In other words, to recognize I'm no longer a slave. I'm no longer controlled by others. I'm no longer living a life that has no scope for growth. And therefore, my whole life has to be about finding opportunities for growth. Now imagine if we could adopt that into our parenting style, which is, my parenting style is not simply about telling children, this is what we believe, and if you're going to live in my home, you're going to comply with these particular requirements, etc., etc. Imagine if it was all about, these are the things that I value, and I will model to you how important they are to me. And we all know this, by the way, that the things that children latch onto more than anything else are the things that we actually illustrate a deep commitment to in our behavior, not just in our words. Because ultimately you can tell children whatever you want. Children are highly, highly attuned to hypocrisy, and they are allergic to hypocrisy. So the minute a child hears or sees us doing something that clashes with the stated values we have, forget about it. They will never follow that ever again in their lives. So I am Hashem your God is a teaching about how Judaism should be, that it should be a way of life, not a religion. It should be something that absorbs everything that we do, not only the things that officially conform to a list. And we should try and adopt that into our parenting style, which hasn't yet answered our core question, which is, so should we be compromising ourselves for our children? That was the core question, right? So first you have to set the stage. Until you set the stage, you can't answer that question. That's why in Judaism we always answer questions with questions, because we appreciate that if you really want to delve into a topic fully, you first have to have the context of that topic. You can't talk about whether we compromise ourselves or our values or the things that we care about for our children until we have created the context of what it means to be a parent in Judaism. And that a parent in Judaism is not giving a list of demands to our children and then getting offended when they don't follow those demands. That is an ego trip, and that has no place in parenting. Parenting should never be about self. It should be about values and about higher ideals and about growth. Give me a second, then we'll come to the questions. So that's really what the message is over here. First, set the stage. Setting the stage is that we want to have values that are so meaningful and so valuable that they are not just a black and white checklist, that these are things we care about, therefore our children should care about them too, in the same way as Hashem wants us to care about our relationship with Him, not just simply to do the things that He tells us. But here's the fascinating thing. Anybody who's familiar with Rashi's commentary, you'll know that Rashi, as best he can, keeps everything really concise. And one of the things that he does in order to keep things concise is he'll always choose a perspective about the verse that is the simplest to understand. Rashi will always only comment if there's something about the simple verse that doesn't seem to make sense. Like in this case, why does it have to say, who took you out of Egypt? Anytime that Rashi adds additional perspectives, you have to ask yourself, why do we need more information? You're always so succinct. Why do you need more information? And Rashi does that here too. He says there are two alternative interpretations of what it means, I am Hashem, your God. The one is that when the Jews were crossing the Red Sea, they saw a vision. And in that vision, Hashem appeared to be this warrior who was destroying the Egyptian army. Yet here at the foot of Sinai, they also had a vision. And in this vision, they saw Hashem as depicted in the cartoons, I guess, as a kindly old man with a flowing white beard. So Hashem says, I am Hashem, your God, who took you out of Egypt. Don't think for one moment that there's more than one deity, because you saw one vision as you came out of Egypt, and you're seeing a different vision over here. Recognize it's all the same. Then Rashi gives a third interpretation. His third interpretation is, at the time that they were standing at Mount Sinai, the sound came from all directions. It was the first surround sound experience, right? So the sound came from all directions. And so Hashem says, don't think that there are multiple beings speaking. I am Hashem, your God. It's a single God who is speaking. Now here's where things get intriguing. We know that one of the unique things about the Ten Commandments is that they are all in the singular. I am Hashem, your God. Elokecha is the singular for you, instead of Elokechem, like we say in the Shema, which is your God in the plural. And in the next line, when it says Lo yiyeh lecha, that you, the individual, should not have other gods besides me. It's in the singular. Now, Rashi tells us that that was really important because we know that not long after this, the Jews are going to make the golden calf, and Hashem is going to be very disappointed that they make a golden calf. And Moshe, at that point, is going to defend the Jewish people. And one of the things that he's going to use in his defense is to say, you said it in the singular. They thought you were only talking to me. They thought you were not addressing the nation yet with a prohibition against making other idols. And therefore, they didn't yet realize that this is a universal principle. They thought you were talking to me. You said it in the singular. Did Hashem not see that coming? Obviously he did, right? Why does Hashem say it in the singular, which could be misleading? In fact, it could even be misleading if you think this. Imagine you're standing at the foot of Sinai and you're hearing voices coming from all directions speaking in the singular. You could actually think, there's a God for me, there's a God for you, there's a God for the next person. Because it's a different voice coming from a different direction, speaking to an individual. Maybe there are many, many gods. So maybe Hashem should have avoided this problem by saying, I am Hashem, your God, in the plural. So even if we hear all these multiple voices, there'll be no doubts in anybody's minds that it's Hashem speaking, one God. And the reason why Hashem says it in the singular is to give Moshe an opportunity to defend the Jewish people when they behave in the worst possible way. What does that teach you? It teaches one of the most profound things about Hashem's relationship with us, which in turn is supposed to teach us about our relationship with our children. Don't lock yourself into words that can do more harm than good. Even though your message has to be clear, even though your value system has to be uncompromising, never say it in a way that the child has no way back from their mistakes. When we talk about compromising yourself for your children, that doesn't mean you compromise your values. But it means that you do sometimes, in the way that you lead your child, in the way that you educate your child, in the way that you instruct your child, sometimes you have to compromise the force with which you say it so that if they get it wrong, it's not an absolute and a point of no return. Had Hashem said, I am Hashem, your God, in the plural, you in the plural should have no other gods besides me, then the fact that the Jewish people made such a horrific mistake just a few weeks later by building a golden calf would have been a point of no return. Now that's despite the fact that Hashem has made it clear in the opening sentence that his values are non-negotiable. That he's made it clear in the opening sentence that it's not just a matter of checking the boxes, but that your whole life is to be dedicated to me. Even outside, I want you to use your own insight and your own initiative and find ways that you could show your connection and your love and your dedication to me besides what I've told you, as any parent would tell their child. Show me that you care. Don't just wait for me to tell you. In spite of all of that power in his message, Hashem chooses to say the instruction of the thing he knows could be the most difficult for them to comply with, to say it in a way that there's a little bit of a gap, that the child could save face, that the people could wiggle their way out of it and find their way home. If we're not willing to compromise ourselves when we're sharing our values, then we could be too stuck on ourselves and our child might reject our values. But when we are willing to be clear and uncompromising in what we care about, but completely open to the possibility that the child needs some flexibility, then we've allowed them a way back when they've stepped out of line. And the greatest gift that you can give any person is an opportunity to fix when they've made a mistake. And way too often we clamp down, we clam up, we don't allow, we tell them how bad they've been, we rub it in, we reiterate, and that blocks the opportunity for the child to recover, to fix, to learn, to grow. And then that child is in Egypt, because Egypt is a place where you can't live, so you can't learn and you can't grow. And the whole objective was, I am Hashem your God to take you out of Egypt. I am Hashem your God to take you to a place where you're never stuck, where there'll always be a way back home. That might be one of the most important things for a parent to keep in mind when dealing with any issue in the parent-child relationship, where there could be contention, where there could be conflict, where there could be rebellion. It's absolutely critical that in the most difficult conflicts, the most difficult moments of disagreement, there's always a door open to find a way back.